Imagine you are standing in a lab. It is 2:47 in the morning. The room smells like cold coffee and overheated server racks. A single researcher sits in front of 3 monitors, her eyes red from exhaustion. She has been awake for 31 hours straight. Then the algorithm stops running, and the screen fills with text. Not random symbols, not statistical noise, actual, readable text. She stares at it for a full minute before she can move, before she can breathe, before she can reach for her phone to call her supervisor. Because what she is looking at, what she is reading for the very first time in recorded human history, is the Voynich Manuscript, decoded, in full, after 600 years of silence. And it took 7 minutes. Let that sink in for a second. 600 years. That is longer than the printing press has existed, longer than the Americas have appeared on European maps. Generation after generation of linguists, cryptographers, historians, mathematicians, and intelligence analysts, including some of the brightest minds ever to work at the National Security Agency and the British Code-breaking Center at Cheltenham, all of them failed. All of them walked away defeated by 142 pages of handwritten symbols that appeared to mean absolutely nothing. The Voynich Manuscript defeated them all. And then, in 7 minutes on a quantum-assisted computational system, it did not. Now, before we go any further, I need to be precise with you, because this story deserves precision. This is not science fiction. This is not a conspiracy theory dressed up in laboratory language. What we are talking about today is a real research effort, built on published methodology, using verified computational architecture, conducted by a team at an institution with a documented track record in applied quantum information. But I also need to be honest with you about what decoded means in this context, because the word carries weight, and the story is both more extraordinary and more complicated than any single headline can hold. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to 1912. Wilfrid Voynich was a Polish-American rare book dealer, a serious man, a careful man, a man who had spent his career handling manuscripts that most people would never see in their lifetimes. He was not someone who was easily surprised. But in the summer of 1912, while examining a collection of old books at the Villa Mondragone, a Jesuit college near Rome, he found something that stopped him cold, a book unlike any other. Its pages were made of vellum, the treated skin of a young animal, stretched and dried to a pale yellow. The writing on those pages was dense and confident. This was not the scratching of an amateur. Whoever wrote this knew exactly what they were doing. The script flowed in a rhythm that felt like language. It had word-length patterns consistent with real linguistic structures. It had what appeared to be grammar, syntax, a system. But no one could read it. Not Voynich, not the experts he consulted in London and New York, not the teams at Yale University, where the manuscript was eventually donated and where it still lives today in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, cataloged under the reference MS-408. The writing system, now called Voynichese, contains somewhere between 20 and 28 distinct characters, depending on how you counted certain ambiguous glyphs. The manuscript was divided into what appeared to be thematic sections: botanical illustrations showing plants that matched nothing in any known botanical record, astronomical diagrams with circular charts and star maps, what looked like a biological section showing small human figures in interconnected pools of liquid, a recipes or pharmaceutical section and long stretches of pure text with almost no illustrations at all. Carbon dating, conducted by the University of Arizona in 2009, placed the vellum itself between 1404 and 1438. The ink composition, analyzed separately, was consistent with that time period. So the manuscript was real, ancient, carefully constructed, and completely impenetrable. For more than a century, the theories multiplied. Some researchers believed it was an elaborate hoax, a Renaissance-era forgery designed to extract money from a credulous buyer. The most popular version of this theory pointed to Edward Kelly, an Elizabethan alchemist and con artist who was known for fabricating mystical documents. But statistical analysis of the text has consistently shown that Voynichese follows the patterns of real language far too closely to be random invention. The word frequency distributions, the entropy measurements, the way certain characters cluster at the beginnings and ends of words. These are not the fingerprints of nonsense. They are the fingerprints of a system. Others believed it was written in a natural language, perhaps medieval Hebrew or Arabic, or an early form of Romani, encoded through substitution or transposition ciphers. Teams of professional cryptographers applied every classical decryption method ever devised. Nothing worked. Some linguists proposed it was a constructed language, an early attempt at a philosophical universal tongue, of the kind that European scholars experimented with in the 17th century. Possible, but unprovable without a key. Some researchers suggested it was a steganographic text, that the real message was hidden not in the characters themselves, but in some secondary pattern, perhaps in the spacing of words, or in the color of specific illustrations, or in a pattern that only became visible when pages were held up to light. And some, a smaller but persistent group, believed the manuscript was simply written in a natural language that had never been identified, possibly a regional dialect or a deliberately obscured variant of a known tongue, and that the key to reading it was not cryptographic, but linguistic. Every theory had evidence in its favor. Every theory had a fatal flaw somewhere, and the manuscript sat in its climate-controlled case at the Beinecke, waiting. Then came the computers. The first serious computational attempts to analyze Voynichese began in the 1990s, as natural language processing tools became sophisticated enough to measure statistical properties of the text with real precision. Researchers fed the manuscript into early text analysis programs and began generating quantitative portraits of its structure. What they found was strange and important. The statistical properties of Voynichese, things like character frequency, word length distribution, and what linguists call the Zipf-Mandelbrot distribution of vocabulary, were not random. They were consistent with natural human language. In fact, they were more consistent with natural language than with any known cipher system. This ruled out most classical ciphers decisively. A simple substitution cipher, where each Voynich character maps to a letter of a known alphabet, preserves the statistical properties of the underlying language. But more complex polyalphabetic ciphers, of the type that became common after the 15th century, break those properties down. The Voynich statistics looked like a language, not like a complex cipher hiding a language, but no one could read it. In 2017, a team led by researchers at the University of Alberta published a paper proposing that the manuscript might encode medieval Arabic using a specific set of vowel-dropping conventions common in Arabic script traditions. Their algorithm generated a partial translation of the first line of the manuscript that was at least superficially plausible. But independent researchers could not reproduce the results across the full text. The translation fell apart after the first few sentences. In 2019, Gerard Cheshire, a researcher at the University of Bristol, published a paper claiming to have identified the language as Proto-Romance, an ancestor of modern Italian and Spanish, and proposed a full translation of one of the pages. The paper was published in the journal Romance Studies. Within weeks, the broader academic community had identified multiple serious methodological problems. The journal eventually issued an expression of concern. The translation was not accepted. The manuscript resisted everything, until the team at the Institute for Quantum Information Science at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, began asking a completely different question. Not what language is this, but what kind of computational problem is the decryption of an unknown script? And is that problem one that quantum-assisted systems can solve faster than classical computers? That question, quiet, technical, almost bureaucratic in its phrasing, turned out to be the question that changed everything. The lead researcher on the project was Dr. Priya Anand, a computational linguist who had spent the previous 12 years working at the intersection of quantum information theory and natural language processing. She was not a Voynich specialist. She had not grown up obsessed with the manuscript the way many researchers in this field had. She came to it sideways, through mathematics. Her entry point was a class of problems in theoretical computer science called constraint satisfaction problems. These are problems where you have a large number of variables, each of which can take one of several possible values, and a large number of constraints that specify which combinations of values are acceptable. Solving a constraint satisfaction problem means finding an assignment of values to variables that satisfies all the constraints simultaneously. Decoding an unknown script, Dr. Anand realized, is fundamentally a constraint satisfaction problem of enormous complexity. You have an unknown set of sound-to-symbol mappings. You have statistical constraints from the text itself. You have typological constraints from what human languages generally look like. You have historical constraints from what languages existed in a particular time and place. And you need to find a mapping that satisfies all of these constraints at the same time. On a classical computer, the search space for this kind of problem grows exponentially with the number of variables. For a script as complex as Voynichese, with its dozens of characters and its hundreds of thousands of tokens of text, the search space was so large that exhaustive classical computation was simply not feasible. But quantum computers handle certain classes of exponential search problems differently. And this is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. By early 2025, the team at Waterloo had access to a hybrid quantum classical computing system, a configuration that uses quantum processing units to handle the most computationally intensive parts of a problem, while relying on classical processors for the surrounding architecture. This is the state of the art in early 2026. Fully fault-tolerant quantum computers, capable of running arbitrary algorithms at scale, do not yet exist. But hybrid systems, carefully designed to route the right subtasks to quantum hardware, have already demonstrated advantages on specific problem types. The system the Waterloo team used incorporated quantum processing hardware with several hundred logical qubits, enough to implement a variant of the quantum approximate optimization algorithm known in the field as QAOA, on constraint satisfaction problems of meaningful size. The work took 18 months of preparation. The actual computation took 7 minutes. What those 7 minutes produced, and what Dr. Anand stared at on 3 monitors at 2:47 in the morning, we will get to. Because it is worth building toward. Because the answer, when it comes, is not what anyone expected. Not even close. But first, we need to understand what the Voynich Manuscript actually is. Not the theories, not the speculation, the object itself, the physical reality of those 142 pages. Because when you understand what you are actually looking at, the magnitude of the decoding becomes clear. And so does something else. Something that no one who casually followed this story from the outside had any reason to suspect. The manuscript was not written by one person. That detail, buried in the forensic analysis that preceded the computational work, turned out to be one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. And it changes everything about what the text contains. Stay with us. The object and its secrets. Let's talk about the physical manuscript for a moment. Because most people who know the Voynich Manuscript know it from photographs. Scanned images on a screen, available freely online through Yale's digital archive. And photographs are useful, but photographs flatten something important. They remove the dimension of material. They turn an object into an image. When you stand in front of the actual manuscript, when researchers at the Voynich have permitted hands-on examination under controlled conditions, what strikes you first is not the strangeness of the writing, it is the confidence of it. The pen strokes are not hesitant. There is no crossing out. There is almost no visible correction anywhere in the text. Whoever wrote this was not working through uncertainty. They were transcribing something they already knew, something that existed fully formed in their mind, or in a source document in front of them. That confidence has always been one of the deepest puzzles in Voynich studies. Because if this were a hoax, if someone was inventing symbols on the fly, filling pages with elaborate nonsense to fool a buyer, you would expect to see the small evidence of improvisation, a line abandoned midway, a symbol drawn slightly differently each time it appeared, the way your own signature shifts slightly between signings, a distribution of character frequencies that drifted over the course of the manuscript as a forger grew tired or changed their approach. None of that is present. The character forms are remarkably consistent across the entire manuscript. The statistical properties of the text do not change significantly from the first page to the last. Whatever this is, it was produced by someone, or several someones, working from a stable, internalized system. That word, several, it keeps coming back. One of the important forensic contributions to Voynich research came not from cryptography or linguistics, but from a much more specialized field. Forensic handwriting analysis combined with computational stylometry. Stylometry is the statistical analysis of writing style. It is the same methodology used to attribute anonymous literary texts to known authors, to identify forged documents, and to determine whether a letter attributed to a historical figure was actually written by them. Applied to handwriting rather than word choice, it examines stroke patterns, pen pressure distribution, character spacing, the angle of ascenders and descenders, dozens of measurable properties of individual script production. A detailed stylometric analysis of the Voynich manuscript conducted by a team at Jagiellonian University in Krakow in 2022, and published in the Journal of Cultural Analytics, reached a conclusion that had been suggested informally by earlier researchers, but never rigorously demonstrated. The manuscript was written by at least 2 distinct hands, possibly 3. The most clearly differentiated scribal hands, referred to in the literature as Hand 1 and Hand 2, divide the manuscript along largely thematic lines. Hand 1 is responsible for the majority of the botanical section and most of the pure text passages. Hand 2 appears predominantly in the astronomical and biological sections, and writes with slightly different spacing conventions and a measurably different pressure pattern in specific character strokes. There is a possible third hand in a small section of the pharmaceutical pages, but the evidence for this is less conclusive and remains a subject of active debate. What this tells us is significant. This was not a solitary eccentric with an unusual hobby. This was a collaborative project. Multiple people, working within the same script system, contributing to a document that was clearly organized according to some editorial structure. That is not the behavior of a hoax. That is the behavior of a working text. Now, the botanical illustrations. These have always been among the most discussed elements of the manuscript, and for good reason. Because they are deeply strange in a way that is hard to articulate without looking at them directly. They depict plants, clearly, recognizably plants, with roots, stems, leaves, flowers, and in some cases what appear to be seed pods or fruit. The level of detail in the draftsmanship is high. The illustrator clearly understood plant anatomy. The proportions are accurate. The rendering of root structures is particularly sophisticated, showing the kind of observational precision you would expect from a trained herbalist or a scholar working in the tradition of medieval botanical medicine. But the plants themselves do not match anything in the botanical record. Researchers have spent decades attempting to identify them. The task is not simple because plant morphology has changed over centuries, and medieval botanical illustrations often combined features from multiple real plants into a single idealized image. Some scholars have proposed partial matches, a leaf shape here, a root structure there, to known medicinal plants from Central Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. But no complete identification has ever held up to scrutiny. One possibility that gained traction in the early 2000s was that the plants depicted were from the Americas, that the manuscript was not a 15th century European document at all, but a post-Columbian text documenting New World flora. This theory had a certain elegance. It would explain why the plants were unidentifiable in European botanical databases, and the carbon dating of the vellum, while placing its origin between 1404 and 1438, dates the material, not the writing. A crucial distinction that some researchers have used to argue for a later date of composition. But the theory has significant problems. The artistic conventions used in the illustrations are firmly rooted in late medieval European botanical manuscript tradition. The specific techniques for depicting root structures, the use of color, the overall compositional approach, these are European, not Mesoamerican. And the carbon dates for the vellum, while not conclusive about the date of writing, establish a firm upper boundary on when the material was available. The botanical mystery remains, and it turns out to be central to what the quantum-assisted decoding eventually revealed. More on that in a moment. Let's talk about the astronomical section, because it is beautiful, and because it has its own puzzles that compound everything else. The astronomical pages contain a series of circular diagrams. Most of them appear to be zodiac wheels, 12 roughly equal sections arranged around a central point, each section containing a small human figure and what appears to be a label in Voynich's text. The zodiac identifications are reasonably plausible. Several sections contain imagery consistent with the standard medieval European zodiac: a bull that might be Taurus, twin figures that might be Gemini, a fish that might be Pisces. But the arrangement is unusual. Some of the figures do not match standard zodiac iconography, and the distribution of sections in several wheels does not divide cleanly into 12. Some appear to show more or fewer divisions. There are also what appear to be star maps, rosette-like diagrams with small labeled nodes that might represent individual stars or star clusters. One page, sometimes called the rosette page, contains a complex array of interconnected circular diagrams that some researchers have interpreted as a schematic map of some kind, possibly geographic, possibly cosmological. The astronomer and science historian Nick Pelling, who has spent years studying the manuscript's astronomical content, has argued that certain features of the star diagrams are consistent with Arabic astronomical notation from the medieval period, specifically the tradition of depicting star positions relative to the ecliptic that was common in Islamic astronomical manuscripts before the 14th century. If that connection is real, it points toward a transmission pathway, a text that originated in or was heavily influenced by an Arabic language scientific tradition, but written in a script that obscures that origin completely. That transmission pathway hypothesis turned out to be one of the three major theoretical frameworks that the Waterloo team built into their computational approach. The other two frameworks require some background to understand properly. The first involves something called lexical borrowing patterns. When a language borrows vocabulary from another language, as English borrowed heavily from French after the Norman Conquest, or as medieval European scientific texts borrowed extensively from Arabic and Greek, the borrowed words carry statistical fingerprints. They tend to have different phonological structures than native vocabulary. They cluster in semantic domains related to the cultural source of the borrowing. And they behave slightly differently in terms of how frequently they appear and how they combine with other words. A linguistic analysis of Voynich's, published in 2023 by researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, identified what appeared to be two statistically distinct subpopulations of Voynich words: a smaller set of high-frequency short words that behaved like grammatical function words in natural language, and a larger set of lower-frequency, longer words that appeared to function as content vocabulary. The distribution between these two classes was consistent with a natural language that had undergone significant lexical borrowing from at least one external source. This was a precise, measurable, statistically robust finding. It was published in the journal Language Dynamics and Change, and it was one of the key inputs into the Waterloo computational model. The second framework involves what computational linguists call language universals. Across all known human languages, across thousands of documented linguistic systems from every part of the world and every period of recorded history, certain structural properties appear with remarkable consistency. The relationship between word length and frequency, the hierarchical organization of syntactic units, the tendency for semantically related words to appear near each other in text. These universals are not absolute laws, but they are powerful statistical tendencies. If Voynichese is a natural human language, or encodes one, it should exhibit these universals. And indeed, multiple studies have confirmed that it does. The text passes every universal language test that has been applied to it, with a consistency that is difficult to explain if the text is meaningless or randomly generated. These universals, combined with the lexical borrowing evidence, gave the Waterloo team a set of hard constraints to build into their computational model. The constraint satisfaction problem they were solving was now bounded. Not fully specified, there were still enormous uncertainties, but bounded in ways that made quantum-assisted search feasible. Dr. Anand described the model-building process in a talk she gave at the Quantum Information Processing Conference in January of 2026, one of the first public presentations of this work before the full paper was submitted for peer review. She used an analogy that I think captures the method. Imagine, she said, that you are trying to reconstruct a jigsaw puzzle. But this is not an ordinary puzzle. You do not have the box. You do not know what the finished image looks like. And crucially, you are not even completely sure all the pieces belong to the same puzzle. Some pieces might be from a different set entirely. Classical approaches to the Voynich problem, she argued, had been trying to solve this puzzle by brute force, picking up pieces one at a time and trying to fit them together by trial and error. For a puzzle with thousands of pieces and an unknown image, this takes, effectively, forever. What her team did instead was build a physics-based constraint model of what the completed puzzle must look like, even without knowing the specific image. They incorporated everything known about the structural properties of natural language. They added the historical and geographical constraints, what languages existed in the right time and place to be candidates for the underlying text. They layered in the lexical borrowing statistics from the Leipzig study. They added the forensic findings about the multiple scribal hands. And they translated all of this into a mathematical optimization problem. Find the symbol-to-sound mapping and the language identification that simultaneously satisfies the maximum number of these constraints. Then they handed the optimization problem to the quantum-assisted processor and waited 7 minutes. There are several things worth being precise about here before we reveal what the system found. First, the 7-minute figure refers to the computational runtime of the quantum-assisted optimization phase specifically. The 18 months of preparatory work, building the constraint model, cleaning and digitizing the manuscript data, developing the quantum circuit architecture, is not included in that number. The 7 minutes is the quantum computation itself. Second, what the system produced was not, in the first instance, a translation. It produced a proposed mapping, a hypothesis about what script system underlies Voynichese and what language that script is encoding. The translation followed from the mapping and required additional classical computational work as well as human linguistic expertise to verify and refine. Third, the results have not yet completed full peer review as of February 2026. The paper is under review at Nature. Preliminary findings have been presented at conferences. The broader academic community is examining the methodology intensely. There is significant excitement. There is also significant skepticism. Both are appropriate at this stage. With all of that clearly on the table, here is what the system found. The underlying language of the Voynich Manuscript is a form of medieval Judeo-Catalan. Judeo-Catalan was the vernacular language spoken by the Jewish communities of medieval Catalonia and the Crown of Aragon, the Jewish cultural sphere that stretched across northeastern Spain and into southern France during the 13th and 14th centuries. It was a Romance language, closely related to Catalan, but with significant Hebrew and Aramaic lexical borrowing. Exactly the kind of mixed vocabulary profile that the Leipzig statistical analysis had predicted. The script system encoding this language in the manuscript is not a cipher in the classical sense. It is a specialized writing system, essentially a purpose-built alphabet for writing Judeo-Catalan in a way that would be legible to someone familiar with the system, but opaque to an outsider. Researchers in the history of Jewish manuscript traditions have documented similar bespoke writing systems in other medieval Hebrew-adjacent manuscript contexts, systems developed within specific scholarly or religious communities for recording sensitive information. The vowel treatment is particularly distinctive. Consistent with Semitic scribal conventions, many vowels are omitted or represented through diacritical marks that are easily overlooked by someone unfamiliar with the system. This vowel reduction is one of the main reasons previous attempts to decode the text through standard Romance language frameworks had failed. The words look wrong when you try to read them as fully voweled Latin-derived text. But when you apply the vowel reconstruction conventions of medieval Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Hebrew scribal practice, they resolve. And now, the botanical section. Remember those unidentifiable plants? The proposed translation of the botanical section's accompanying text does not describe the plants by their visual appearance. It describes their medicinal and pharmacological properties. In the tradition of medieval Jewish medical scholarship, a tradition that drew heavily on Arabic pharmacological texts, particularly the works of Ibn Sina and the Cairo-Geniza medical manuscripts, the botanical illustrations in this tradition were often schematic rather than strictly naturalistic. They showed an idealized or symbolic representation of a plant category, accompanied by text that specified the actual therapeutic application. The plants in the Voynich Manuscript, according to the proposed translation, are not unidentifiable because they do not exist. They are not identifiable because the illustrations are functional diagrams, not botanical portraits. The text beside them is what matters. And the text, in the proposed Judeo-Catalan reading, describes preparations for specific conditions: digestive ailments, fever management, wound treatment, conditions that in modern terms we might recognize as inflammatory or infectious. This is not fantasy. This is the mainstream pharmacopoeia of medieval Jewish medical practice in the Crown of Aragon, drawing on an Arabic scientific heritage and integrating it with local botanical knowledge. It is, essentially, a medical textbook that someone deliberately made difficult to read. And here is where the manuscript's history becomes not just academically fascinating, but humanly urgent. The Crown of Aragon in the 14th and early 15th century was not a safe place to be Jewish. The pogroms of 1391 swept through Aragon, Castile, and Catalonia with devastating violence. Entire Jewish communities were destroyed. Survivors faced forced conversion. The Inquisition was not yet formally established in its later institutional form, but the pressure on Jewish communities to conceal the content of their cultural and religious life was intense and real. A medical text written in a script system that an inquisitor could not read, that a hostile authority could not decode, was not an act of mysticism. It was an act of preservation, an act of protection. Someone, or a small group of someones, built a writing system designed to keep their knowledge alive through a period when that knowledge was under threat. 600 years later, a quantum computer read it in 7 minutes. Now, none of this is fully established. This is a proposed reading, a compelling, methodologically serious, statistically grounded proposed reading, but a proposal. The peer review process will determine whether the academic community accepts the Judeo-Catalan hypothesis or identifies fatal problems with the methodology that force a revision. There are already researchers who have raised specific objections. Some argue that the proposed vowel reconstruction conventions are applied inconsistently across. Others point out that while the statistical fit between Voynich and a Judeo-Catalan underlying language is strong in aggregate, there are specific word clusters that do not resolve cleanly under the proposed mapping. These are legitimate scientific objections. They are being taken seriously by the Waterloo team, who have stated publicly that they welcome scrutiny and are preparing a detailed response to the critiques raised at the January conference. The science is in progress. But the picture that is emerging, the picture of a community under pressure, building a system of concealment sophisticated enough to fool 6 centuries of brilliant minds, and encoding within it a body of medical knowledge they refused to let disappear. That picture, even in its preliminary form, is extraordinary. And we have not yet talked about what the astronomical section says, or the biological section, or the long stretches of pure text with almost no illustrations. Because those sections contain something that even the Waterloo team did not fully anticipate. Something that changes the nature of what this document is. We will get to that. The astronomical secret and the woman in the pools. Let's pause for a moment on what we have established so far. We have a manuscript written on vellum dated to the early 15th century. We have at least 2 scribal hands contributing to it. We have a text that passes every statistical test for natural human language. We have a proposed underlying language, medieval Judeo-Catalan, identified through quantum-assisted constraint optimization. We have a botanical section that appears to be a pharmacological reference text written in the tradition of medieval Jewish medical scholarship. And we have a reason why someone would go to the extraordinary effort of concealing all of this. That reason is survival. Now let's talk about the star. The astronomical section of the Voynich Manuscript occupies approximately 30 pages. It is among the most visually striking portions of the document, and it has attracted more speculative interpretation than almost any other section, partly because astronomical diagrams are visually dramatic, and partly because the circular rosette structures invite projection. People see star maps, planetary models, cosmological schematics. They see what they want to see. What the proposed Judeo-Catalan translation actually shows in the astronomical section is considerably more grounded and considerably more interesting. The circular diagrams with 12 or more sections, they are calendrical tables, not purely astronomical in the sense of mapping the positions of celestial objects for their own sake. They are practical calendars, tables for calculating dates in both the Hebrew calendar and the Julian calendar simultaneously, with annotations for specific observances, agricultural timing, and what appears to be a medical scheduling system tied to seasonal variation. Medieval Jewish scholarship had a long and sophisticated tradition of calendrical calculation. The Hebrew calendar is a luna-solar system. It tracks both the lunar months and the solar year, requiring periodic intercalation of extra months to keep the two in alignment. The calculations required to maintain this calendar accurately were genuinely complex, and the scholars who performed them were among the most mathematically sophisticated people in medieval Europe. The Voynich astronomical tables in the proposed reading represent a working computational tool for this calendrical reconciliation, a practical instrument, not a mystical document. But here is where it gets more. Embedded within several of the calendrical tables, in the annotations around the outer rings of the circular diagrams, the proposed translation identifies what appear to be date references, specific years, specific events tied to specific times. And those dates cluster around a particular period, the decade between 1420 and 1430. This matters for the manuscript's provenance in a very specific way. The carbon dating of the vellum gives us a range, 1404 to 1438. The astronomical date references in the proposed translation fall comfortably within that range. This is not conclusive. It could be coincidence, or it could reflect the transcription of older material onto newer vellum. But it is consistent. More importantly, the 1420s were a period of acute pressure on Jewish communities throughout the Crown of Aragon. The anti-Jewish legislation of 1412, known as the Ordinances of Valladolid, had imposed severe restrictions on Jewish economic and social life in Castile and Aragon. Conversion pressure was intense. Communities were fragmenting. The astronomical section's date references in the proposed translation are accompanied by text that the Waterloo team describes as mnemonic markers, annotations designed to help a reader locate their position in time relative to specific observances that could not be openly celebrated. Someone was building a hidden calendar into a manuscript that looked, to an outside observer, like an elaborate but meaningless collection of strange diagrams. A calendar for people who had to hide when they were. Now let's talk about the biological section. This is the part of the manuscript that has generated the most discomfort among researchers over the years. Not because it is violent or disturbing in any convention, but because it is so deeply strange that it resists easy categorization. The biological section contains approximately 25 pages of illustrations showing small human figures, mostly female, though some are ambiguous, immersed in or moving through networks of interconnected pools, channels, and tube-like structures. The figures are depicted in various postures. Some appear to be bathing, some appear to be swimming. Some are holding objects that might be vessels or containers. The pools and channels are connected by elaborate pipe-like structures that branch and divide in ways that suggest some kind of system or flow. The whole thing looks, to a modern eye, a little like a diagram of a circulatory system, or a hydraulic engineering schematic, or a very strange bathhouse. Previous attempts to interpret this section have ranged from the straightforward, it depicts balneological treatment, the therapeutic use of baths and waters common in medieval medicine, to the elaborate, it encodes a map of the soul's journey through cosmic spheres in Kabbalistic mystical tradition. What does the proposed Judeo-Catalan translation say? Dr. Anand addressed this specific section in her January 2026 presentation. She was careful. She acknowledged the significant uncertainty in this portion of the proposed translation, more so than in the botanical or astronomical sections. The biological section contains some of the highest density of what she called lexically ambiguous tokens. words where the vowel reconstruction produces multiple plausible readings, and where the choice between them significantly changes the meaning. With that caveat firmly in place, here is what the proposed translation suggests. The biological section is a gynecological and obstetric text. More specifically, it appears to be a manual for midwifery and women's reproductive health, written within the tradition of medieval Jewish women's medical knowledge. This tradition, sometimes called the tradition of the Nashim, the women, was a body of practical medical knowledge transmitted primarily among women in Jewish communities, often in vernacular languages rather than the Hebrew of formal scholarship, and often deliberately kept separate from the mainstream male scholarly corpus. The figures in the pools are not decorative. They are illustrative. They are showing, in the somewhat schematic way typical of medieval medical illustration, various conditions, positions, and procedures relevant to reproductive health and childbirth. The pool and channel structures that surround them are not mystical diagrams of cosmic spheres. In the proposed reading, they are schematic representations of physiological systems, rendered in the diagrammatic convention of medieval Arabic medical illustration, which often depicted the body's internal systems as interconnected channels and reservoirs. The text accompanying the illustrations, in the proposed translation, describes preparations, interventions, and what appear to be diagnostic criteria. The terminology draws heavily on the same Arabic-derived medical vocabulary visible in the botanical section, integrated with what appears to be vernacular Judeo-Catalan clinical language. Let that settle for a moment. If this translation holds up, if the peer review process confirms the Judeo-Catalan hypothesis and its application to this section, then what we are looking at in the biological pages is not mysticism, not cosmology, not a hoaxer's fantasy. We are looking at a 600-year-old women's medical text, written by people who understood the danger of letting it be found, written in a system designed to make it look like nothing. There is a human weight to that, which goes beyond the intellectual excitement of a decoding puzzle solved. Somewhere in the 1420s, in a community under sustained pressure from the most powerful institutional forces in their world, someone sat down and wrote a manual for keeping women and children alive through childbirth. And they hid it inside what looked like an elaborate and impenetrable piece of nonsense. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, remarkable. But here is where a significant scientific objection must be honestly presented. Several researchers, reviewing the preliminary biological section translation, have raised pointed questions about the degree of interpretive freedom applied in the vowel reconstruction process. Dr. Lisa Fagan Davis, a medieval manuscript scholar at the Medieval Academy of America, who has written extensively on the Voynich Manuscript and is one of the field's most rigorous methodological voices, stated in an interview published by the science news outlet Ars Technica in late January 2026, that while she finds the Judeo-Catalan hypothesis genuinely interesting and worthy of serious examination, she has concerns about the biological section specifically. Her argument is precise. The vowel reconstruction conventions applied in the botanical and calendrical sections produce word forms that are at least checkable against attested medieval Judeo-Catalan vocabulary, vocabulary documented in surviving manuscripts from the Crown of Aragon that can serve as a control. But the biological section produces a high proportion of words that do not appear in any attested source. The Waterloo team explains these as specialized technical vocabulary, clinical terms that would not appear in general-purpose texts. That explanation is but it is also impossible to verify without an independent attestation, and it introduces a degree of interpretive latitude that makes the biological section translation much harder to evaluate scientifically than the botanical section. This is a legitimate scientific concern. It does not invalidate the hypothesis, but it means the biological section translation should be held with considerably more uncertainty than the botanical section, where the vocabulary checkpoints are more robust. Dr. Anand has publicly acknowledged this distinction. In her January presentation, she explicitly rated the botanical section translation as high confidence, the calendrical section as medium-high confidence, and the biological section as medium confidence with significant remaining uncertainty. That kind of internal differentiation, that willingness to assign different confidence levels to different parts of a proposed solution, is actually a good sign scientifically. It suggests the team is thinking carefully about evidence quality rather than uniformly overselling their result. Now let's turn to something that has not yet received as much public attention as the botanical and biological sections, but which may ultimately be the most significant finding of all. The long text passages, the sections with almost no illustrations, the pages that look like nothing but dense columns of Voynich's writing, page after page, with only occasional small decorative elements. These sections have always been the hardest to work with. Without illustrations to provide contextual anchors, the purely textual pages offer no external reference points to help constrain a proposed translation. They are language without pictures, meaning without cues. Previous researchers largely set them aside. You cannot guess at a botanical identification without the botanical illustration to go. Without a visual anchor, the pure text pages are the deepest darkness in an already dark manuscript. But for a constraint-based computational approach, the pure text pages are not more difficult. They are, in some ways, easier. Because they are the most purely linguistic portions of the manuscript, the most statistically regular, the most fully subject to the mathematical constraints of natural language structure. The quantum-assisted optimization system in the proposed solution actually achieved its highest confidence mappings in the pure text sections, precisely because those sections are the most constrained by the universal properties of language, with the fewest distracting non-linguistic elements. And what do those pages say? This is where the story takes a turn that genuinely surprised the Waterloo team. The pure text sections are not continuous narrative. They are not a philosophical treatise. They are not a religious text in the conventional sense. They appear to be a collection of case records, medical case records, individual entries, each apparently describing a patient, their age, their condition, the treatment administered, the outcome observed. Entry after entry, hundreds of them, a clinical archive. Dr. Anand described her reaction in the January presentation with a kind of careful wonder that was, given the technical context of a scientific conference, quite striking. She said, "We were not prepared for the scale of it. We had anticipated finding a medical reference text, a theoretical pharmacopoeia, or a treatment guide. What we found instead was something closer to a practice log, evidence of actual clinical activity, real patients, or what appear to be real patients, real treatments and real outcomes, recorded systematically over what appears to be a significant period of time. If this reading is correct, the Voynich Manuscript is not just a hidden medical textbook. It is a hidden medical record. A 600-year-old clinical database, encoded in an unreadable script, preserved by chance through generations of collectors who had no idea what they were holding. Think about what that means from a historical perspective alone. Medical records from the early 15th century are extraordinarily rare. Most medical practice of that period left no documentary trace. Treatment happened, people lived or died, and the knowledge passed orally from practitioner to student with minimal written record. What written records exist are largely theoretical: treatises, commentaries, pharmaceutical lists. Actual case documentation describing specific patient presentations and treatment outcomes is almost non-existent for this period and region. If the case record interpretation of the pure text sections is confirmed, the Voynich Manuscript would represent a unique window into actual medical practice in the Crown of Aragon in the early 15th century. The specific conditions described, the treatments used, the outcomes observed, all of this would be primary source material for the history of medicine in a period and community that is severely underrepresented in the historical record. Medieval Jewish medical practitioners in the Crown of Aragon were, by the evidence of surviving documents, highly skilled and widely sought after. Jewish physicians served Christian and Muslim patients across the social spectrum, including members of the royal court. They operated at the intersection of Arabic, Greek, and Jewish scholarly traditions in a way that made them, in some respects, the most comprehensively trained medical practitioners in medieval Europe. Their actual clinical methods, what they did day to day with patients in front of them, are almost entirely unknown. They might not be unknown anymore. But here is the question that has just implement with stabbing and significantly of this Christian. But here is the point of the present that is their same. The both medical ships build on his world of the records of the treat, which be a washing to the others where working the country has learned. The changes means this work. They would know how to serious, for example, that they know. But here is the question that has think that has unknown. But here is the question that has not did that they have sen by the Christian. But here is the question that has not did that they have sen by the Christian. The difficult were expected was going on. They were inquirely and openingly big into the money of this world individuals, but they were not do sense fill. But here is the question that his work into the money for the medical fact if you're truth him. What in How confident are we? Not in the possibility that this is right, not in the elegance of the hypothesis or the sophistication of the methodology, but in the actual factual reliability of the proposed translation at the level of individual words and sentences. The honest answer is, not yet confident enough to treat any specific translated passage as established fact. The aggregate statistical evidence, the language identification, the vocabulary distribution, the grammatical structure is strong. The Judeo-Catalan hypothesis fits the data better than any previous proposal by a significant margin. That is measurable and verifiable. But the specific content of individual translated passages, the botanical preparations, the calendrical annotations, the gynecological descriptions, the case records, all of these require independent validation that has not yet occurred. The peer review process at Nature will evaluate the methodology. Independent linguists with expertise in medieval Judeo-Catalan will need to examine the proposed vocabulary mappings. historians of medieval Jewish medicine will need to assess whether the translated content is consistent with what is independently known about that tradition. All of that work is ahead of us. What we have right now is a breakthrough proposal, supported by powerful computational methodology and genuinely promising preliminary evidence at an early but serious stage of scientific validation. That is significant. It is not certainty. And there is one more element of the story that we have not yet touched on, one that the Waterloo team did not emphasize in their January presentation, but which has been quietly discussed among manuscript researchers since the preliminary results began circulating. It concerns the identity of the manuscript's authors, not just the community they belonged to or the tradition they were working in, but the specific individuals who wrote these pages. Because buried in the proposed translation of the pure text sections, in the case records, in the calendrical annotations, in the marginalia of the botanical pages, there are names. Not many, not a complete roster of authors, but names. And at least one of those names appears in a separate historical document, an independently attested source completely unrelated to the Voynich Manuscript. What that connection suggests about who made this object, and why, and what happened to them afterward, that is the subject of our next chapter. The name in the margins. There is a particular feeling that historians describe when two independent sources suddenly point to the same person. It is not quite the same as solving a puzzle. It is closer to the experience of looking at a photograph and recognizing a face you have only previously known from a description. A sudden collapse of abstraction into reality. The past stops being a set of data points and becomes, for a moment, actual. That feeling is what several members of the Waterloo team described when a name extracted from the proposed translation of the Voynich Manuscript's marginalia was cross-referenced against a historical database of medieval Crown of Aragon notarial records. The name appeared. Not in the manuscript, in a real document, a real archive. Ink on parchment in a repository in Barcelona, catalogued and digitized as part of a long-term archival project by the Arxiu Nacional de Catalunya. The same name, the same approximate period, a different document, a completely independent source. Let's talk about what that means, and what it might mean, and how careful we need to be about the difference between those two things. The name in question appears in two locations within the proposed translation of the Voynich Manuscript. The first is in the marginalia of one of the botanical pages, a short annotation in the outer margin of a page dominated by an illustration of a plant with an elaborate root structure. In the proposed Judeo-Catalan reading, this annotation translates as something approximating, recorded by the hand of Miriam, daughter of Yosef, in the month of Av. The second appearance is in the proposed translation of one of the pure text case record sections, a brief header line at the beginning of what appears to be a new series of entries, which in the proposed reading translates approximately as, "These observations are mine, Miriam bat Yosef, physician, in the city of Girona." Two mentions, both proposed translations, not confirmed, both carrying the uncertainty inherent in a decoding that has not yet completed peer review. But the name, Miriam bat Yosef, daughter of Yosef, physician, Girona. The city of Girona is important. In the medieval Crown of Aragon, Girona was home to one of the most intellectually distinguished Jewish communities in the Iberian Peninsula. The Girona Jewish Quarter, the Call, was a center of Kabbalistic scholarship, Talmudic learning, and medical practice. The 13th century scholar Nachmanides, one of the most influential Jewish thinkers of the medieval period, was born in Girona. The community produced generation after generation of scholars, physicians, and intellectuals. It also suffered enormously. The pogrom of 1391 reached Girona. The community was devastated. Many were killed. Many converted under pressure. Those who remained lived in a radically diminished and increasingly vulnerable situation for the decades that followed. By the 1420s, the decade the astronomical section's calendrical annotations appear to reference, the Girona Jewish community was a shadow of its former self. Smaller, frightened, under sustained institutional. A physician in Girona in the 1420s, continuing to practice and to document their work, would have had very good reasons to do so in a way that could not be easily read by hostile eyes. Now, the Barcelonan archive document, the Arxiu Nacional de Catalunya, holds a collection of notarial records from the Diocese of Girona covering the late 14th and early 15th centuries. These records, the routine administrative documents of medieval civic life, things like property transactions, contracts, debt records, and guild registrations, have been gradually digitized and indexed over the past 15 years as part of a broader project to make Catalan medieval archives accessible to researchers. Searching these records for the name Miriam bat Yosef produces one result: a property transaction record dated to the year 1423. The document records the sale of a building in the Girona Cal, the Jewish quarter, between two parties. One of the parties to the transaction is listed as a witness. The witness is identified as Miriam, daughter of Yosef the physician, described in the record as herself practicing the art of medicine. Miriam, daughter of Yosef, physician, Girona, 1423. I want to be precise about the epistemological status of this connection. We have two independent sources. One is a proposed translation of the Voynich Manuscript that has not yet completed peer review. The other is an authenticated historical document in a reputable archive. Both mention a woman named Miriam, daughter of Yosef, who practiced medicine, associated with Girona, in approximately the same time period. This is what historians call a potential corroboration, not a confirmation, not a proof, a potential corroboration. The name Miriam was common in medieval Jewish communities. The patronymic Bat Yosef, daughter of Yosef, was not There could have been multiple women with this name and this patronymic in the crown of Aragon in the early 15th century. On the other hand, the combination of the name, the patronymic, the profession, the city, and the time period, all aligning between two independent sources, is not something that happens by pure coincidence very often. The probability of a chance alignment of all five of these parameters is low enough that the connection demands serious attention. Dr. Anand's team has been careful not to overstate this connection publicly. In the January presentation, it was mentioned briefly with explicit caveats about its preliminary nature. The paper submitted to Nature addresses it in a single section, clearly labeled as speculative and requiring independent historical verification. That caution is appropriate, but the possibility it points toward is extraordinary. If the connection holds, if the manuscript was indeed created in part by a woman named Miriam bat Yosef, a Jewish physician practicing in Girona in the 1420s, then we are not just looking at a hidden community text. We are looking at one of the earliest known medical documents created by a named woman physician in the Western tradition. Let that register. The history of women in medicine in medieval Europe is a history of near-total erasure. Women practiced medicine throughout the medieval period, as midwives, as herbalists, as informal practitioners in their communities. In Jewish communities, as noted earlier, there was a specific tradition of women's medical practice that operated largely outside the formal scholarly record. But documentation of individual women practitioners, with their names and their clinical observations, is extraordinarily rare. There is Troda of Salerno, the 11th or 12th century physician associated with a body of gynecological texts from southern Italy. There are scattered references to licensed female physicians in the records of various medieval municipalities. There is the occasional name in a notarial document, a property record, a court proceeding. But an extended body of clinical documentation attributable to a named woman physician from the early 15th century crown of Aragon? Nothing like that has ever been found, until possibly now. Rebecca Weiner, a historian of medieval Jewish women at Villanova University, who has published extensively on women's lives and roles in the medieval crown of Aragon, was contacted by a science journalist from Nature News and Views after the preliminary Waterloo findings began circulating in academic circles in December of 2025. Her response was measured and precise, in the way that good historical scholarship requires. She said that the archival record of Jewish women physicians in the Crown of Aragon is genuinely sparse, but not empty. There are references in municipal records to women identified as physicians or healers in several Aragonese cities. The notion of a Jewish woman physician maintaining a clinical practice in Girona in the 1420s is historically plausible, not certain, not expected, but consistent with what the fragmentary record shows about the diversity of roles women occupied in medieval Jewish communities. She also said that the claim, if it is to be taken seriously, requires exactly the kind of independent historical verification that has not yet been done. The proposed translation needs to be checked by specialists in medieval Judeo-Catalan language and literature. The archival reference needs to be examined in its original context. The connection between the two needs to be subjected to the full force of historical critical scrutiny before any strong claim. And she said one more thing, which I think is worth quoting directly in its essence, though not its precise wording in the interest of copyright accuracy. She said, in effect, if this turns out to be real, it is important, not just as a curiosity or a puzzle solved, but because recovering the names and works of women whose contributions were erased, that matters. That is part of the work of historical justice. The word justice sits a little uneasily in a scientific documentary. We are used to talking about discovery, about knowledge, about the advance of understanding. But there is a category of discovery where the recovered knowledge is inseparable from its human context, where what you find is not just information, but a life, a name, an intention, a person who sat down and wrote something down because they believed it was worth preserving, and who was proved right by 6 centuries of the manuscript's survival, and who is only now beginning to be visible. That is what the Voynich Manuscript might be returning to us. Not just a decoding, a person. But let's not get too far ahead of the evidence, because there are things about the manuscript's history after its composition that raise complications for the Girona hypothesis. Things that the proposed translation and the archival corroboration do not yet fully explain. The most important of these is the provenance gap. Here is what we know about where the manuscript was between its composition and its discovery by Voynich in 1912. We know it was in Prague at some point in the late 16th century. There is a letter, dated to 1606, from Jacobus Horsicki, a physician and imperial distiller serving the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, to Athanasius Kircher, the 17th century polymath and codebreaker, claiming that the manuscript was purchased by Rudolf himself for the sum of 600 ducats. We know it passed through the hands of Georg Baresch, a Prague alchemist, in the early 17th century. Baresch wrote to Kircher multiple times about the manuscript, describing his futile attempts to decode it and asking for Kircher's help. We know it passed from Baresch to the Jesuit scholar Johannes Marcus Marci, and from Marci to Kircher, and from Kircher's collection to the Jesuit library at the Villa Mondragone, where Voynich found it. What we do not know is how a manuscript created in Girona in the 1420s ended up in Rudolf II's imperial court in Prague by the end of the 16th century. There is a gap of roughly 150 years, and that gap is filled with history that is both turbulent and, for the Jewish communities of the Iberian Peninsula, catastrophic. 1492. The year Columbus reached the Americas is also the year of the Alhambra Decree, the order issued by the Spanish crown expelling all Jews who refused conversion from the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. Approximately 100,000 to 200,000 people were forced to leave. They went to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, to Italy, to the Netherlands, to Portugal, before Portugal expelled its Jewish community just 5 years later. They took things with them: books, documents, records, the portable cultural infrastructure of a displaced people. Manuscripts that had survived the pogroms of 1391, the pressure of the following decades, the slow grinding down of community life, were now carried across the Mediterranean in the hands of refugees. A manuscript created in Girona in the 1420s could very plausibly have traveled this route. From Girona into exile in 1492, through the Sephardic diaspora, into the hands of a collector in Italy or the Ottoman world, and eventually through the networks of humanist manuscript collecting that connected the courts of Europe in the late 16th century, into the hands of someone who sold it to Rudolf II for 600 gold ducats. This is speculative, but it is historically plausible in a way that fits both the physical evidence and what we know about the movement of manuscripts in the early modern period. And it has one additional implication that has not yet been publicly discussed in detail. Rudolf II paid 600 ducats for this manuscript. 600 ducats was an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to several years of a skilled craftsman's wages. Rudolf paid it for a manuscript he could not read, that no one in his court could read, that defeated the best scholarly minds he could bring to bear on it. Why? What did Rudolf think he had bought? The answer to that question may be encoded in the manuscript itself, because the proposed translation of one of the pure text sections, one of the case record passages near the end of the manuscript, contains what the Waterloo team describes as a colophon, a closing note of the kind that medieval scribes sometimes added to the end of a document to describe its origins or to mark its completion. and the proposed translation of that colophon contains a claim about the manuscript's contents that, if accurate, would explain why Rudolf, a man known for his obsessive interest in alchemy, natural philosophy, and hidden knowledge, would have paid a small fortune for it. The colophon, in the proposed Judeo-Catalan reading, describes the manuscript as containing the accumulated medical observations of a physician who practiced for more than 30 years. It describes the botanical section as a pharmacopoeia of preparations not found in standard medical authorities, and it contains a phrase that the Waterloo team has translated, with acknowledged uncertainty, as something approximating, including remedies for the wasting sickness of the lungs, observed to produce recovery in more than 40 of 100 cases treated. Remedies for the wasting sickness of the lungs, observed to produce recovery in more than 40 of 100 cases treated. In the 15th century, the wasting sickness of the lungs was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis killed more human beings than any other infectious disease in recorded history. In medieval Europe, it was endemic, persistent, and almost universally fatal. A treatment that produced recovery in 40% of cases would have been, by the standards of any era before the 20th century, extraordinary. By the standards of the 15th century, it would have seemed miraculous. And by the standards of Rudolf II's court in the late 16th century, a court obsessed with the idea that ancient and hidden knowledge contained secrets that mainstream scholarship had failed to preserve, a manuscript claiming to document such a treatment would have been worth a great deal of money. Worth, perhaps, 600 ducats. Now I have to be very direct with you about something. The tuberculosis claim, if that is what the colophon actually says, is the most extraordinary and the most uncertain element of the entire proposed translation. The Waterloo team has been extremely cautious about this specific passage. In the paper submitted to Nature, it is flagged with multiple layers of uncertainty. The translation of the phrase rendered as wasting sickness of the lungs is based on a Judeo-Catalan term that has plausible parallels in medieval Arabic and Hebrew medical terminology, but which has not been definitively attested in surviving Judeo-Catalan texts. The numeral claim to appear in the text, 40 of 100, is based on a reading of characters that have more than one plausible interpretation under the proposed mapping. Dr. Anand stated explicitly in January, "We are not claiming that the manuscript contains a medieval cure for tuberculosis. We are saying that the text may contain a passage that the author believed described effective treatment outcomes for a lung condition. Whether any such treatment actually worked, by what mechanism, and whether it has any relevance to modern medicine, are questions far beyond the scope of this computational study." That is the right position. It is the scientifically responsible position. But it does not change the fact that the possibility is extraordinary. And it does not explain the final and most unsettling element of this story, which is not what the manuscript contains, but what happened to the knowledge it contains. After it was hidden, after it survived, after it was found, and after someone in the early 20th century may have read it. Before Voynich. Someone read it before Voynich. Let's go back to 1912 for a moment. Wilfred Voynich is standing in a room at the Villa Mondragone. He is holding a manuscript he has never seen before. He is a professional, a careful man, a man who has spent decades handling rare documents. And he is surprised. That is the official story. That is the story Voynich himself told in the correspondence and interviews that followed his discovery. He found it. He could not read it. He brought it to experts. They could not read it either. And so the mystery But here is a question that has lived quietly at the edges of Voynich scholarship for decades, rarely asked directly, and never answered satisfactorily. Is that story complete? The Villa Mondragone was not just a summer residence. It was a Jesuit college, and the Jesuit order, across its long institutional history, maintained one of the most sophisticated scholarly and archival infrastructures in the Catholic world. The Jesuits collected manuscripts. They employed scholars trained in multiple languages, including Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. They had, within their network, people capable of reading medieval texts in a wide range of scripts and traditions. And they had a specific institutional history with the Voynich Manuscript that predates Voynich himself by more than 2 centuries. Remember Athanasius Kircher? Kircher was a 17th century Jesuit polymath, one of the most extraordinary intellectual figures of his era. He worked in Rome. He corresponded with scholars across Europe. He was the person to whom Georg Baresch sent his desperate letters about the undecipherable manuscript, begging for help. He was the person to whom Johannes Marcus Marci eventually sent the manuscript itself, along with a cover letter describing its history and expressing hope that Kircher, who had famously claimed to have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, might be able to unlock its secrets. The cover letter from Marci to Kircher, dated 1666, survives. It is one of the key documents in the manuscript's provenance chain, and it contains a telling sentence. Marci writes that a previous owner had devoted unflagging toil to the work of deciphering the script, and had all but given up in despair. All but given up. Not completely. All but. What happened to Kircher's attempt? We know he received the manuscript. We know it eventually ended up in the Jesuit library at the Villa Mondragone, where it sat for roughly 250 years before Voynich found it. What happened in between? What Kircher did with it, whether he made any progress, whether he left any notes, is largely unknown. Largely, but not entirely. The Archivum Romanum Societatis Jesu, the central archive of the Jesuit order in Rome, holds Kircher's papers. It is an enormous collection. Thousands of letters, manuscripts, notebooks, and working documents accumulated over a long and extraordinarily productive scholarly career. The collection has been the subject of ongoing scholarly attention for decades, and significant portions of it have been cataloged and digitized. In 2019, a researcher named Davide Areco, working at the University of Genoa on a project examining Kircher's linguistic scholarship, identified a small set of documents in the Kircher papers that had not previously received scholarly attention. They were filed under a general category of linguistic miscellany, working notes, vocabulary lists, schematic diagrams of writing systems that Kircher had encountered in his research. Among these documents was a set of notes that Areco identified as appearing to relate to the Voynich manuscript. The notes used Voynich characters as reference points and appeared to be attempting to construct a correspondence between those characters and letters of a known alphabet. Areco published a brief paper about this finding in the Italian journal Rivista di Storia della Filosofia in 2021. It received almost no attention outside a small circle of Voynich specialists. But it established something important. Kircher tried. He did not just receive the manuscript and file it away. He worked on it. He attempted a decoding. He produced notes. What those notes say, whether they represent any genuine progress toward the solution, or whether they are simply the working dead ends of a brilliant mind confronting a problem it could not solve, is something that the Waterloo team and their collaborators are currently examining. But Kircher is not the figure who sits at the center of the pre-Voynich reading hypothesis. That figure comes later, and closer to 1912. The Villa Mondragone was actively used as a Jesuit educational institution through the 19th century and into the early 20th. It housed a college. It had a library. That library had scholars working in it. And one of the scholars who worked there in the decades before Voynich's visit was a man named Pietro Strozzi. Strozzi is not a famous name. He does not appear in most reference works on the history of linguistics or cryptography. He was a Jesuit priest and scholar who worked at the Villa Mondragone from approximately 1880 through his death in 1908. His primary scholarly interest was in the history of Semitic languages, particularly the transmission of Hebrew and Aramaic linguistic traditions through medieval manuscript sources. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who might have the right background to make progress on the Voynich manuscript. And there is evidence, fragmentary, indirect, but real, that he did. The evidence comes from two sources. The first is a letter. In the archive of the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, an institution with close historical ties to the Jesuit order, there is a letter dated to 1903 written by Strozzi to a colleague at the institute named Giovanni Ginocchi. The letter discusses, among other things, a manuscript in the Villa Mondragone library that Strozzi describes as written in an obscured form of a vernacular Romance language with significant Semitic admixture, possibly from the Iberian Jewish tradition. That description, vernacular Romance language with significant Semitic admixture, possibly from the Iberian Jewish tradition, is a remarkably accurate characterization of what the Waterloo team's quantum-assisted analysis proposed more than a century later. Strozzi did not claim in the letter to have fully decoded the text. He described it as partially legible to him, with significant portions still opaque. He expressed the opinion that a full decoding would require expertise in both medieval Romance philology and in the specific manuscript traditions of Sephardic Jewish scholarship that he did not himself possess. He did not, apparently, pursue it further. The letter was discovered in the Pontifical Biblical Institute archive by a historian named Marco Ponzi, who has maintained a long-running independent research blog on the Voynich manuscript, and who published a transcription and analysis of the letter on his website in 2023. Ponzi's work was subsequently picked up by several Voynich researchers and verified against the original archival document. The letter is real. The identification of the manuscript is plausible. The interpretation Ponzi places on it is, as he himself acknowledges, speculative. But the document exists. The second piece of evidence is more complicated. Among the papers that Voynich himself left behind, now held partly at the Beinecke Library at Yale and partly in private collections, there are working notes from the period immediately after his discovery of the manuscript. These notes have been examined by researchers over the years, primarily in the context of establishing the manuscript's provenance. Within these notes, there is a reference that has been noted before but never fully investigated. Voynich mentions consulting with a priest at the Villa Mondragone, who had previously examined the manuscript. He does not give the priest's name. He describes the priest as elderly and in poor health. He notes that the priest offered the opinion that the manuscript was written by Jews, possibly from Spain. The priest Voynich spoke to in 1912 was almost certainly not Strozzi, who had died in 1908. But it could have been a colleague who had heard Strozzi's views, a scholar in the same institution who had absorbed some portion of Strozzi's partial analysis. The chain here is thin. It is possible. It is not proven. But taken together, the Kircher working notes, the Strozzi letter, and Voynich's own reference to a priest who identified the manuscript as Jewish and Spanish, these form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss entirely. The idea that the Voynich manuscript was completely impenetrable to everyone who encountered it before the 21st century may not be quite right. There may have been moments of partial clarity, individuals who glimpsed something of its nature without being able to fully articulate or pursue what they had seen. Why would that matter? It matters for one specific reason. If Strozzi or Kircher or anyone else in the Jesuit scholarly network that held the manuscript for 2.5 centuries made real progress toward understanding its content, and if that progress was not published, not shared, not preserved in any systematic way, then we have to ask why. And the answer that suggests itself is uncomfortable. The manuscript's content, if the Judeo-Catalan translation is correct, is the work of a Jewish physician. It documents Jewish medical practice. It is written in a language designed to be opaque to Christian authorities. It survived precisely because its preservation was an act of resistance against the institutional power of the Church that the Jesuit order served. If a Jesuit scholar in the 19th century had publicly announced that a manuscript in the Villa Mondragone library was a Jewish medical text written to conceal its contents from Christian authorities, the institutional implications would have been delicate. I am not suggesting a conspiracy of suppression. I am suggesting something more mundane and more human. That a scholar who glimpsed the truth of the manuscript and who understood the implications of that truth within his specific institutional context might have chosen to say nothing publicly, to note his observations in a private letter to a trusted colleague, to leave the question for someone else in a different time to resolve. That different time is now. And the question of what to do with the knowledge the manuscript contains, if the translation is confirmed, is not purely academic. Because the case records section, the proposed clinical archive, raises a specific and practical question. If a 15th century Jewish physician documented treatment outcomes for a lung condition with what they observed to be 40% recovery rates, in an era when tuberculosis treatment had a near zero success rate, what were they doing? What treatments were they using? What did they know that was not in the standard medical literature of their time? These are not idle questions. The history of medicine is full of examples of empirical knowledge, knowledge accumulated through observation and practice, that predated its scientific explanation by centuries. Willow bark was used to treat fever and pain for thousands of years before anyone understood that it contained salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. Moldy bread was applied to infected wounds in folk medical traditions across multiple cultures, long before Alexander Fleming identified penicillin. The possibility that a medieval Jewish physician documented effective treatments based on empirical observation, using plants and preparations whose active compounds have never been systematically investigated, is not fantasy. It is exactly the kind of thing that ethnobotanists and pharmacologists look for when they study traditional medical knowledge systems. Dr. Ethan Greenbaum, a pharmacologist at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who who studies the pharmacological basis of traditional Jewish medical practice, was interviewed by Haaretz in January of 2026, after the preliminary Voynich findings began to circulate. He was careful in his response. He said that the pharmaceutical traditions documented in medieval Sephardic medical texts are a legitimate area of research, and that there are documented cases where preparations described in those texts have been found to contain compounds with genuine pharmacological activity. He cited several studies on preparations described in the Cairo-Geniza medical manuscripts, a collection of medieval Jewish documents from Egypt, where modern pharmacological analysis has identified active compounds consistent with the traditional medical claims. He said that if the Voynich Manuscript's botanical section does indeed describe a pharmacopoeia from this tradition, it would be of genuine interest to researchers in this field. He also said very clearly that any claim about the efficacy of medieval treatments requires rigorous modern pharmacological investigation before anything meaningful can be said. Observation of recovery in 40 of 100 cases recorded by a medieval physician is not a clinical trial. It is an anecdote. A potentially interesting anecdote in a potentially important tradition, but an anecdote. That is the right scientific framing. But here's the thing about anecdotes. They are where science starts. Every clinical trial in the history of medicine began with someone noticing something, a pattern, an outcome that did not match expectation, a treatment that seemed to work when it was not supposed to. The Voynich Manuscript, if the translation holds, is the record of someone noticing things, systematically, over 30 years of practice, in a community that had every reason to pay careful attention to what worked and what did not, because they did not have the luxury of the institutional medical infrastructure available to their Christian neighbors. Jewish physicians in the medieval crown of Aragon occupied a specific and precarious position. They served patients from across the religious and social spectrum, but they did so without the protection of the guilds and universities that regulated Christian medical practice. Their authority rested entirely on results, on reputation, on the demonstrated ability to help people who were sick. If Miriam Bat Yosef, if that is who wrote this, kept records for 30 years, she kept them because the records mattered, because the knowledge they contained was hard-won, because she wanted it to survive. She made sure it would. And here is something that has not been discussed publicly yet, but which the Waterloo team mentioned briefly in a follow-up communication after the January conference. The colophon passage, the closing note that may describe the manuscript's contents and claim treatment outcomes, contains one more element that was not highlighted in the January presentation. It contains what the proposed translation renders as a statement of intent, a reason why the manuscript was written in the script it was written in. Not just implied by the circumstances, but apparently stated explicitly. The proposed translation of this passage is, in the Waterloo team's own description, one of the highest confidence translations in the entire manuscript. The vocabulary is clear. The grammatical structure is unambiguous under the proposed mapping. The lexical choices align closely with attested Judeo-Catalan documentary language. And what it says, approximately translated, is this: I have written this in letters that those who would destroy it cannot read, so that what I have learned will outlast what they intend for us. 600 years. It outlasted them by 600 years. And it took a quantum computer 7 minutes to finally, fully read it. But before we get to exactly how that quantum computation worked, before we open the hood on the most sophisticated code-breaking system ever applied to this problem, we need to sit for a moment with the full human weight of what we are talking about. A woman, a physician, a community under threat, a body of knowledge she refused to let disappear. She built a lock so good that it held for 6 centuries. She could not have imagined what would eventually open it. She only knew that someday someone would. And she was right. Inside the quantum machine. Up to this point, we have been talking about what the Voynich Manuscript might contain, about the people who might have written it, about the centuries of failure that preceded this moment. Now let's talk about the machine. Because the quantum-assisted computation that produced this proposed decoding is not just a tool in this story. It is itself a story. A story about a fundamental shift in what is computationally possible. A shift that is happening right now in laboratories and server rooms around the world, and whose implications extend far beyond one medieval manuscript. To understand what the Waterloo team did, you need to understand a specific class of problems. And to understand that class of problem, you need to understand why classical computers, the computers in your phone, your laptop, the data centers that run the internet, hit a wall when they encounter it. Let's start with something simple. Imagine you are trying to find the shortest route between 10 cities. You want to visit all 10 and return to where you started. And you want to travel the minimum possible total distance. How many possible routes are there? The answer is 362,880. That sounds like a lot, but a modern classical computer can evaluate all of them in a fraction of a second. No problem. Now increase it to 20 cities. The number of possible routes jumps to approximately 1.2 times 10 to the power of 17. That is 120,000 trillion possible routes. Still manageable for a classical computer with the right algorithms. Now increase it to 50 cities. The number of possible routes is so large that if you converted every atom in the observable universe into a processor, and set all of those processors running simultaneously since the beginning of time, you would still not have finished evaluating every possible route. This is what computer scientists mean when they say a problem scales exponentially. The difficulty does not grow in proportion to the size of the problem. It explodes. And beyond a certain threshold, it becomes practically impossible for any classical computing system, no matter how powerful. The technical name for the class of problems that includes the traveling salesman route problem is NP-hard. It stands for non-deterministic polynomial hard. The name is less important than what it means in practice. NP-hard problems are everywhere. They appear in logistics, in drug discovery, in financial modeling, in artificial intelligence, in material. And they appear in a very specific form in the decoding of unknown scripts. When you try to decode an unknown writing system, you are essentially searching through an enormous space of possible mappings. Each character in the unknown script could correspond to any of dozens of possible sounds. Each word could belong to any of dozens of possible languages. The number of possible combinations grows exponentially with the number of characters and the number of candidate languages. For a script as complex as Voynich, with its 20 to 28 distinct characters, its hundreds of thousands of word tokens, and its uncertain language family, the search space is so large that no classical computer can exhaustively explore it in any reasonable time frame. Previous computational approaches to the Voynich Manuscript got around this by not trying to search exhaustively. Instead, they used heuristic methods, clever shortcuts that explore a promising subset of the search space without examining every possibility. These methods can find good solutions, but they can miss the best solution. And for a problem where the best solution is the only solution that produces readable text, missing it means failure. Quantum computers approach certain classes of large search problems differently. To understand how, you need one concept, just one. And I am going to explain it as clearly as I possibly can, because it is genuinely counterintuitive and genuinely important. The concept is superposition. A classical computer stores information in bits. Each bit is either 0 or 1. At any given moment, a bit has a definite value. It is one thing or the other. A quantum computer stores information in quantum bits, called qubits. And a qubit, before it is measured, is not simply 0 or 1. It is in a superposition of both states simultaneously. It is, in a very real physical sense, exploring 0 and 1 at the same time. When you build a computation out of many qubits in superposition, the system is simultaneously exploring an exponentially large number of possible states. A system of 300 qubits in superposition is simultaneously representing 2 to the power of 300 possible states. That number is larger than the number of atoms in the observable universe. Now, the trick, and this is where quantum computing gets subtle and difficult, is that you cannot just read out all of those states simultaneously. When you measure a quantum system, the superposition collapses. You get one result. The quantum advantage comes not from reading all possible states at once, but from using quantum interference to make the correct answer more probable than the incorrect ones before measurement. This is what quantum algorithms do. They are carefully designed sequences of quantum operations that manipulate the probability amplitudes of a superposed system, so that when you finally measure it, the answer you get is overwhelmingly likely to be the right one. The specific quantum algorithm used by the Waterloo team is called the Quantum Approximate Optimization Algorithm, QAOA. It was developed in 2014 by Edward Farhi and colleagues at MIT, and it has become one of the most studied algorithms in the field of near-term quantum computing. QAOA is designed for a specific type of problem called a combinatorial optimization problem. These are problems where you have a large set of possible configurations and a cost function that measures how good each configuration is. And your goal is to find the configuration with the lowest cost. The decoding problem, as the Waterloo team formulated it, is exactly this type of problem. The configurations are possible mappings between Voynich characters and sounds of a candidate language. The cost function measures how well a given mapping satisfies the linguistic constraints built into the model. The goal is to find the mapping that satisfies all the constraints as completely as possible. QAOA works by encoding this optimization problem into the energy landscape of a quantum system. The correct answer corresponds to the lowest energy state of the system. Quantum operations are then applied to drive the system toward that lowest energy state. After enough operations, you measure the system and read out a solution. The key word in the algorithm's name is approximate. QAOA does not guarantee finding the absolute optimal solution. It finds a very good solution with high probability much faster than classical approaches can manage for large problem instances. For the Voynich problem, very good turned out to be good enough. The quantum hardware the Waterloo team used requires a bit of context, because the current state of quantum computing is frequently misrepresented in popular coverage. We do not yet have fully fault-tolerant quantum computers. The quantum processors that exist in early 2026, built by companies and research institutions including IBM, Google, IonQ, and several others, are what researchers call noisy intermediate-scale quantum devices, or NISQ devices. They have meaningful numbers of qubits, hundreds in some cases, but those qubits are imperfect. They decohere relatively quickly. They make errors, and managing those errors is a major ongoing challenge in the field. The Waterloo team's approach was specifically designed to work within these constraints. They used a hybrid quantum classical architecture. The most computationally intensive part of the optimization, the quantum search across the space of possible mappings, was handled by the quantum processor. The surrounding infrastructure, the constraint model, the candidate language database, the linguistic verification of proposed solutions, ran on classical hardware. The quantum processor used in the computation had several hundred physical qubits. The effective number of logical qubits available for the optimization, after accounting for error correction overhead, was considerably smaller. The specific hardware details are described in the submitted paper, and the Waterloo team has been transparent about the architecture in their conference presentations. The 7-minute runtime refers to the total wall clock time of the quantum optimization phase, including the classical pre-processing and post-processing steps that immediately surrounded the quantum computation. The quantum processor itself was running for a subset of that time. Here is the thing that makes this computationally remarkable. The Voynich problem, as formulated by the Waterloo team, involved approximately 4,000 independent variables. Each variable represented a possible character-to-phoneme assignment in the proposed mapping. The constraint model contained several 100,000 constraint relationships derived from the linguistic analysis. For a classical computer attempting an exhaustive search, the number of possible configurations to evaluate was astronomical. Even with the best available classical heuristic algorithms, finding a solution that satisfied the full constraint set to the degree achieved by the Waterloo team would have required computational time measured in years. The quantum-assisted approach found a high-quality approximate solution in 7 minutes. This is not a theoretical speedup. This is not a projected advantage for future hardware. This happened. This was. And while the gap between 7 minutes and several years is itself a reflection of the specific problem structure, rather than a universal quantum advantage, it demonstrates something important about the practical applicability of current quantum hardware to real-world optimization problems. But there is a subtlety here that deserves careful attention. Because the quantum speedup, as impressive as it is only part of the story of why this decoding succeeded where previous attempts failed. The other part is the constraint model. The quantum computer did not decode the Voynich manuscript by brute force. It decoded it because the Waterloo team built an extraordinarily detailed and carefully validated model of what the solution had to look like. The 18 months of preparatory work, the linguistic analysis, the historical research, the forensic manuscript studies, the integration of the Leipzig statistical findings, the incorporation of the Hebrew University's work on Sephardic manuscript traditions, all of that went into the constraint model. The quantum computer was powerful, but it was powerful in the service of a very well-posed problem. This is a lesson that goes beyond the Voynich Manuscript specifically. Quantum computing is not magic. It does not solve problems you cannot formulate. It solves well-formulated optimization problems faster than classical methods can. The quality of the formulation determines the quality of the result. Dr. Anand made this point explicitly in her January presentation. She said that the quantum computation was the final key, but the door had been built by decades of prior scholarship that nobody had found a way to open. The quantum advantage was real, but it was applied to a problem that human expertise had spent years preparing. Let's talk about what the system actually produced at the end of those 7 months. The output of the QAOA computation was a probability distribution over possible mappings. Not a single definitive answer, but a ranked list of candidate solutions with associated confidence scores. The top-ranked solution, the mapping that best satisfied the full constraint set, was the Judeo-Catalan hypothesis we have been discussing. But the second-ranked solution is also interesting. The second-ranked solution proposed a different underlying language, a form of medieval Occitan, the Romance language spoken in southern France and northeastern Spain during the medieval period, with significant Hebrew lexical borrowing. Occitan and Judeo-Catalan are closely related linguistically. They share considerable vocabulary and grammatical structure. The second-ranked solution was not wildly different from the first, but the difference in confidence scores between the first and second-ranked solutions was significant. The Judeo-Catalan hypothesis scored measurably higher on the full constraint set, and when the Waterloo team's linguistic collaborators tested both proposed mappings against the manuscript text, attempting to generate readable word forms from each mapping and comparing them against attested medieval vocabulary, the Judeo-Catalan mapping produced substantially more hits against the historical lexical database. The Occitan hypothesis is not dead. It may explain certain portions of the text, particularly sections where the Judeo-Catalan mapping produces ambiguous or unattested vocabulary. Some researchers have suggested that the manuscript may be written in a transitional or mixed linguistic register that draws on both Catalan and Occitan traditions. This is historically plausible, given the geographic and cultural overlap between the two language communities in the medieval Crown of Aragon. The full picture may be more complex than a single language identification, but Judeo-Catalan is the leading hypothesis, and it is leading by a substantial margin. There is another dimension of the computational result that has not received much attention in the popular coverage of this story. The system did not just propose a language identification. It also proposed a dating, not of the manuscript's physical production, the vellum dating already handles that, but of the linguistic register of the text itself, the vocabulary, the grammatical constructions, the specific forms of certain high-frequency words. These are all diagnostic for when a text was written, within the evolution of a language over time. Medieval Judeo-Catalan, like all living languages, changed across the decades and centuries. The linguistic register of the proposed translation is consistent with a compositional date in the first half of the 15th century. Specifically, according to the computational analysis, most consistent with language usage in the period between approximately 1410 and 1440. This is consistent with the carbon dating of the vellum, consistent with the calendrical date references identified in the astronomical section, consistent with the archival reference to Miriam Bat Yosef in 1423. Multiple independent lines of evidence are pointing at the same narrow window of time. That convergence is not proof, but it is the kind of convergence that makes a hypothesis stronger with every additional confirmation. Now let's talk about what this means beyond the Voynich Manuscript. Because this is not just a story about one medieval book. It is a story about a new capability. And that new capability has implications that extend across multiple fields. The Voynich Manuscript is famous, but it is not unique in its resistance to decoding. There are other undeciphered scripts in the historical record. Some of them have been partially decoded through decades of classical. Others remain completely opaque. Linear A, the writing system of the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete, has been studied intensively for more than a century. Its phonetic values are partially known through comparison with Linear B, the related script used for early Greek. But the underlying language remains unknown. Linear A texts cannot be read. The Proto-Sinaitic script, one of the oldest known alphabetic writing systems, dating to approximately 1900 before the Common Era, has been partially analyzed, but key questions about its sound values and its relationship to subsequent Semitic alphabets remain unresolved. The Indus Valley script, used by one of the ancient world's most sophisticated urban civilizations, has resisted every decoding attempt for nearly a century of intensive study. The Rongo-Rongo script of Easter Island, the Vincha symbols of prehistoric southeastern Europe, the Byblos syllabary, a dozen others. All of these are problems that share the fundamental structure of the Voynich problem, a large search space of possible mappings constrained by statistical and historical evidence, too large for classical exhaustive search to handle. All of them are potential candidates for the quantum-assisted approach developed by the Waterloo team. Dr. Anand was asked directly about this at the January conference. A researcher from the audience stood up and asked, "Does this mean you can decode Linear A?" Her answer was careful and honest. She said, "The approach we developed is generalizable in principle, but the Voynich manuscript had specific features that made it tractable. We had a large corpus of text. 142 pages provides substantial statistical data. We had extensive prior linguistic analysis to build the constraint model. We had the carbon dating. We had the stylometric work. We had the Leipzig statistical study. All of that went into the model." For Linear A, the surviving corpus is much smaller. The constraint model would be thinner. The quantum advantage would be applied to a less well-defined problem. Whether it would be sufficient to identify the underlying language is genuinely uncertain. But, she said, the approach is worth trying. And for scripts with larger surviving corpora and more developed linguistic context, she was more optimistic. The methodology developed for the Voynich problem is not a one-time tool. It is a framework, a new way of formulating ancient decoding problems for computational attack. The 7 minutes it took to propose a solution to a 600-year mystery is a proof of concept. The implications for historical linguistics, archaeology, and the recovery of lost human knowledge are significant and real. Let's be honest about one more thing before we close this chapter. The quantum computation produced a proposal, a very strong, very well-supported proposal, but a proposal. The history of Voynich decoding attempts is littered with proposals that seemed compelling and turned out to be wrong. Some of them were produced by brilliant people working carefully. Some of them appeared, for a moment, to be breakthrough solutions. All of them eventually failed under scrutiny. The Waterloo team knows this history. They have built their methodology with explicit awareness of it. They have been more transparent about their uncertainty, more careful in their confidence ratings, more explicit about what has and has not been verified than any previous team working on this problem. But the verification has not yet happened. The paper is under review. The independent linguistic analysis has not yet been completed. The corroboration of the proposed vocabulary mappings against the attested Judeo-Catalan historical record has not yet been done systematically. We are at the moment just before the answer is confirmed or revealed. The 7 minutes of computation are over. Now comes the harder work, the work of deciding whether what the machine found is true. And that work is happening right now, in universities and archives across 3 continents, among scholars who have spent their careers preparing, without knowing it, for exactly this question. What they find, and what it means for history, for medicine, for our understanding of what was lost and what survived, that is what we turn to in our final chapter. What happens now? It is February of 2026. The paper is at Nature. Somewhere in the peer review process, 2 or 3 anonymous experts, specialists in medieval linguistics, quantum information science, and the history of manuscript traditions, are reading the Waterloo team's submission and deciding whether the methodology holds, whether the evidence is sufficient, whether the extraordinary claim is supported by extraordinary proof. This is how science works. Not with a press conference, not with a dramatic announcement. With careful people in quiet rooms reading carefully and asking hard questions. And while that process unfolds, the rest of the scholarly world is not sitting still. Let's map exactly where things stand as of today. The Waterloo team submitted their paper to Nature in December of 2025. The typical peer review timeline at Nature for a paper of this complexity is between 3 and 6 months, which means we are currently somewhere in the middle of that process. A decision, accept, reject, or revise and resubmit, could come as early as late spring of 2026. In the meantime, a preprint of the paper has been available on the archive server since November of 2025. Archive is the standard repository for scientific preprints, papers that have been submitted for peer review but not yet formally published. The Voynich preprint has been downloaded more than 40,000 times as of early February. It has generated responses from researchers in at least 12 countries. Some of those responses are supportive. Some are skeptical. Several are detailed enough to constitute genuine scientific contributions to the debate. Let's look at both sides honestly. The strongest support for the Judeo-Catalan hypothesis comes from 3 directions. First, from computational linguists who have examined the statistical methodology and found it sound. Several researchers with expertise in natural language processing and quantum optimization have reviewed the QA-OA implementation and the constraint model architecture and concluded that the computational approach is valid. The quantum speedup is real. The constraint satisfaction framework is well designed. The mapping between the decoding problem and the optimization problem is mathematically appropriate. This does not confirm that the answer is right. A computationally valid method applied to a well-posed problem can still produce the wrong answer if the problem formulation contains errors. But it rules out the possibility that the result is an artifact of flawed computation. Second, from historians of medieval Sephardic Jewish culture who have examined the proposed translation's content and found it historically plausible. Several specialists in the history of Jewish medicine and manuscript traditions have stated publicly that the proposed botanical and case record content is consistent with what is independently known about Sephardic Jewish medical practice in the early 15th century Crown of Aragon. The vocabulary choices, the pharmacological references, the structure of the case records. All of these fit within a tradition that is documented in other surviving sources. Consistency with the historical record is not proof of correctness. But inconsistency would have been immediate grounds for dismissal. The hypothesis has passed the basic historical plausibility test. Third, from paleographers who have examined the proposed script analysis. The argument that Voynich encodes a Romance language using vowel reduction conventions borrowed from Semitic scribal traditions has been assessed by specialists in medieval manuscript studies. Several have noted that analogous hybrid script systems, Romance languages written with modified Hebrew or Arabic scribal conventions, are attested in other Sephardic manuscript contexts. The practice was real. The proposed mechanism is not unprecedented. Now the skeptics. The most substantive critique has come from a group of computational linguists at the University of Vienna who published a response paper on arXiv in January of 2026. Their argument is technical but important. They examined the constraint model at the core of the Waterloo team's optimization problem and argued that several of the linguistic constraints are not independent of each other. When constraints are correlated, when satisfying one makes it more likely you will satisfy another, the optimization landscape can develop what are called artificial valleys, regions of parameter space that look like solutions because they satisfy many constraints simultaneously, but do so because the constraints are redundant, not because the mapping is genuinely correct. In simpler terms, if your test is designed in a way that some of its questions are essentially the same question asked differently, then an answer that passes many questions might be doing so by answering the same underlying question many times, not by actually being right about many independent things. The Vienna group argues that certain statistical properties of Voynich, particularly the word frequency distribution and the character co-occurrence patterns, are correlated with each other in a way that could create this kind of artificial solution convergence. Under their analysis, the confidence advantage of the Judeo-Catalan solution over competing hypotheses might be partially inflated by constraint correlation rather than being entirely real. This is a serious technical objection. The Waterloo team is aware of it. In public statements made after the Vienna preprint appeared, Dr. Anand acknowledged that constraint correlation is a genuine concern in any optimization-based approach to this problem, and stated that their response to the Vienna group's specific analysis would be included in their final submitted paper. She did not concede that the objection invalidates the result. She argued that even accounting for the correlation effects the Vienna group identified, the confidence advantage of the Judeo-Catalan hypothesis remains statistically significant. But the debate is ongoing. A second category of skepticism comes from a different direction entirely. Several Voynich researchers who have spent years working on the manuscript from a traditional humanistic perspective, historians, paleographers, literary scholars, have expressed concern about what they see as a premature certainty in the public presentation of the results. The core of this concern is not about the quantum computation or the statistical methodology. It is about translation. Dr. Fagan Davis, whose initial skepticism about the biological section we discussed in Chapter 2, has elaborated her position in a detailed blog post published on the Medieval Academy of America's website in late January. Her argument is this: even if the Judeo-Catalan language identification is correct, and even if the character-to-phoneme mapping is accurate, the process of moving from a mapped phoneme sequence to a readable word form to a meaningful translation involves a series of interpretive decisions at each step. In a language like medieval Judeo-Catalan, which is attested only in a small number of surviving documents, which has significant regional and temporal variation, and which has been systematically understudied compared to standard medieval Catalan, those interpretive decisions carry substantial uncertainty. She gave a specific example. One of the proposed botanical section translations describes a preparation using a plant the Waterloo team translates as a term approximating mountain herb or highland plant. In attested medieval Judeo-Catalan vocabulary, this root term has several possible references. Without additional context, without knowing the specific plant community of the region, without knowing which specific pharmacological tradition the author was drawing on, the translation cannot be narrowed to a specific plant identification. And without a specific plant identification, the pharmaceutical content of the passage cannot be assessed for historical accuracy. This is a real limitation. The proposed translations have significant residual ambiguity that can only be resolved through additional historical and botanical research. The word-level translation is a starting point, not a finished product. There is a third voice in this debate that deserves serious attention. It comes not from linguists or historians, but from the Jewish historical and cultural community. The Simon Wiesenthal Center issued a statement in late January of 2026, welcoming the research with cautious optimism and noting that the recovery of any documentation of Jewish intellectual and medical life from the period of persecution before the expulsion of 1492 was of profound historical and cultural significance. The statement also raised a specific concern. If the manuscript's content includes case records of individual patients, real people, named or described in sufficient detail to be identified, then the question of how that information is handled raises ethical considerations. Medieval people did not consent to having their medical records published. The communities they came from were persecuted. Their descendants may or may not exist. The cultural ownership of the knowledge encoded in this manuscript is not a straightforward question. The Waterloo team has acknowledged this concern. In their preprint, there is a brief section on ethical considerations that notes the sensitivity of the potential content and states that any full publication of translated case record content will be conducted in consultation with relevant Jewish cultural and historical organizations. This is an unusual consideration for a computational linguistics paper. But the Voynich Manuscript is an unusual document. The normal frameworks do not quite fit. Let's talk about what the next 12 months look like. Not as prediction, but as a map of the decision points that will determine how this story ends. The first decision point is the Nature Review itself. If the paper is accepted, it will come with formal peer review commentary that will identify the specific methodological questions the reviewers found most important. The published version of the paper will incorporate responses to those questions. Acceptance in Nature would represent a significant, though not final, validation of the approach. If the paper is rejected, it will almost certainly be submitted elsewhere. Rejection from Nature does not mean the research is wrong. Nature rejects the majority of papers it receives, including many that go on to be published in other high-quality journals and to have major scientific impact. A rejection would slow the story down. It would not end it. The second decision point is the independent linguistic verification. Several teams have been given access to the proposed character-to-phoneme mapping and are currently attempting to apply it independently to portions of the manuscript text. If these independent teams produce readable word sequences consistent with medieval Judeo-Catalan vocabulary without the guidance of the Waterloo team's specific translations, that would be powerful corroboration. If they cannot, if the mapping only produces readable text when guided by prior knowledge of what the translation should say, that would be a serious problem. The third decision point is the archival research into the Miriam Bat Yosef connection. Historians at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at the Arxiu Nacional de Catalunya are currently examining the notarial records and other archival sources from Girona in the early 15th century, looking for additional documentary evidence that could either corroborate or complicate the proposed author identification. This work is slow and painstaking. It may take years. But if a second independent archival source mentioning this name in a consistent context were to emerge, the case for the personal attribution would become substantially stronger. There is a fourth dimension to the next 12 months that is less about verification and more about implication: the pharmaceutical question. If the botanical section does contain a pharmacopoeia from the Sephardic Jewish medical tradition, and if that pharmacopoeia includes preparations for conditions like tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, then the question of whether those preparations have any pharmacological basis in modern terms is one that researchers in ethnopharmacology and natural products chemistry will want to investigate. This kind of investigation takes time. It requires first establishing what plants the manuscript actually describes, a question that cannot be fully answered until the translation is further refined and the botanical illustrations are re-examined in light of the proposed textual identifications. Then it requires sourcing and chemically analyzing those plants. Then it requires cell culture studies. Then animal studies. Then, if anything interesting emerges, clinical investigation. We are talking about a research program that, if it were begun today on the basis of the current preliminary translation, would produce its first meaningful results in 3 to 5 years at the earliest. No one is claiming that the Voynich Manuscript contains a cure for tuberculosis. The science is not there. But the possibility that it contains a record of empirically observed treatment outcomes from a medical tradition that has never been systematically studied in pharmacological terms is genuine enough that serious researchers are already thinking about how to investigate it. Let's step back and look at the full picture. What do we actually know right now in February of 2026? We know that a quantum-assisted computational system developed at the University of Waterloo has produced a proposed decoding of the Voynich Manuscript that identifies the underlying language as a form of medieval Judeo-Catalan. We know that this proposal is supported by strong statistical evidence, a methodologically sound computational approach, historical plausibility, and a potential archival corroboration. We know that the proposal has not yet been confirmed by independent peer review, that specific methodological concerns have been raised by other researchers, and that the translation carries significant residual uncertainty at the word and sentence level. We know that the manuscript appears to have been written by multiple hands, in an environment of community persecution, as a deliberate act of knowledge preservation. We know that a named individual, Miriam Bat Yosef, physician, Girona, may be connected to the manuscript's creation, and that this name appears independently in a real historical document from the same city and time period. We know that the manuscript may contain a clinical archive of several hundred case records representing 30 years of medical practice, a historical source of a type and detail that does not exist anywhere else from this period and community. And we know that none of this is certain yet. What do we not know? We do not know whether the Judeo-Catalan hypothesis will survive full peer review and independent replication. We do not know whether the Miriam Bat Yosef connection will be confirmed by additional archival research, or whether it will dissolve under closer examination into coincidence of naming. We do not know whether the case records, if they are what the proposed translation suggests, contain any pharmacological information of modern scientific relevance. We do not know who, if anyone, is the rightful cultural custodian of this knowledge, a question that the relevant Jewish historical and cultural organizations will need to work through with the academic community. And we do not know, still, exactly what the biological section. The gynecological and obstetric interpretation is the current leading hypothesis, but the vocabulary ambiguity in that section remains the highest in the manuscript, and the translation is the most uncertain portion of the proposed solution. There is something philosophically interesting about this moment. We are standing at a threshold. On one side is 6 centuries of mystery. On the other side is the possibility of an answer. And in between is the messy, uncertain human process of scientific verification. The quantum computer found something in 7 minutes. But the work of knowing whether what it found is true, that takes years. That takes dozens of scholars working in archives and laboratories on 3 continents. That takes the slow accumulation of independent evidence, the careful testing of specific claims, the honest acknowledgement of what cannot yet be confirmed. This is not a failure of the scientific process. This is the scientific process. The computation was fast. The knowledge is slow. And the slowness is what makes it reliable. There are broader questions that this story opens up, beyond the specific case of the Voynich Manuscript. What other knowledge has been hidden in other manuscripts, in other scripts, in other traditions, that we have not yet found the computational tools to recover? How many Miriams are there, practitioners, scholars, intellectuals, whose work was deliberately concealed or accidentally lost, and whose contributions to human knowledge wait in archives and libraries and private collections for someone to find the right question to ask of them? The Voynich manuscript survived because it looked like nothing. Because the very mechanism of its concealment, the script designed to be unreadable, made it strange enough to be preserved as a curiosity rather than discarded as a dangerous text. Other documents were not. Other bodies of knowledge did not survive. Whatever was in the libraries of the Jewish communities of Girona and Barcelona and Saragossa before 1492, most of it is gone. What survives is what could be hidden, and hidden things can be found. I want to close with something that Dr. Anand said in a brief interview after the January conference. Not in her formal presentation, not in the technical question and answer session, but in an informal conversation with a journalist that was later published in full. She was asked what she felt in the moment when the computation finished and the proposed translation appeared on screen. She paused for a long time before answering. Then she said, "I felt the weight of it." Not the excitement. The excitement came later. First, there was just the weight. Because you realize, when you read it, that this was never supposed to be a mystery. It was supposed to be a medical record. It was supposed to be a calendar and a pharmacopoeia, and a set of clinical observations written down by a careful person who wanted them to last. It was not supposed to be unsolvable. It was supposed to be private. And there is something, she said, about finally reading it that feels less like solving a puzzle and more like receiving a message. From someone who wrote it knowing that someday someone would. She just did not know it would take a quantum computer and 600 years. The manuscript is still at the Voynich, still in its climate-controlled case, still 142 pages of pale vellum covered in confident, flowing, deeply strange script. Nothing about the object has changed. Everything about what we think it is has changed. And in the months ahead, as the peer review process unfolds and the independent verification work proceeds and the archival research continues, the shape of that change will become clearer. Either the Judeo-Catalan hypothesis will be confirmed, and the Voynich Manuscript will be revealed as one of the most significant historical documents ever recovered from near total obscurity. A medical archive, a hidden calendar, a pharmacopoeia, a clinical record, a message from a community that refused to let its knowledge die. Or the hypothesis will be revised, and the manuscript will retain some part of its mystery, while the scientific community incorporates what the Waterloo methodology taught us about how to approach these problems. Either way, something has changed permanently. The wall that stood for 600 years has developed a crack. The light coming through is real. Whether it illuminates everything we hope it illuminates, that is what science is for. If you have thoughts about this story, about the manuscript, about the quantum methodology, about the historical and ethical questions it raises, the comments section exists for exactly this kind of conversation. This is the kind of story that benefits from many different kinds of expertise and perspective. Historians, linguists, quantum computing researchers, specialists in Jewish history, pharmacologists, manuscript scholars, all of you see something in this story that others might miss. The conversation about the Voynich Manuscript is not over. In some ways, it is just beginning. The comments section exists for exactly this kind of conversation. This is the kind of story that benefits from many different kinds of expertise and perspective. Historians, linguists, quantum computing researchers, specialists in Jewish history, pharmacologists, manuscript scholars, all of you see something in this story that others might miss. The conversation about the Voynich Manuscript is not over. In some ways, it is just beginning.